Sarah, our protagonist, was a kind-hearted and compassionate individual who lived in the bustling city of Manhattan. She dedicated her life to the care of animals, particularly dogs, and spent her free time volunteering at animal shelters and fostering stray and abandoned pups. She had a soft spot for senior dogs and had taken in several older canines that no one else wanted, providing them with a loving and comfortable home to spend their golden years. But despite her many positive qualities, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation began as a mere unease, but it soon developed into a full-blown fear that consumed her every waking moment. She tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling never went away. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the woods was closing in on her. Each time she saw him, he seemed to be standing a little closer, his grin stretching a little wider. And then, the sightings became more frequent, almost as if he were taunting her. It started with a glimpse here and there, just a flicker in the corner of her eye, but soon it escalated to full-fledged appearances. The man would appear in her home, standing in the shadows, watching her with that same Cheshire grin as she went about her daily life. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes never leaving her face. As Sarah's fear and paranoia grew, she found herself becoming increasingly isolated from her loved ones. They couldn't see the man she saw, they couldn't understand her fear. They tried to reassure her, telling her that it was all in her head, but Sarah knew what she saw and felt was real. She started to avoid going out and would often cancel plans with friends, citing various excuses. Even when she was out, she would constantly look over her shoulder, convinced that the man was following her. Her relationship with her family also became strained as they couldn't understand what she was going through. But the man never let up. He seemed to be always there, watching, waiting. Sarah started to install cameras in her house, checking them obsessively, but he never appeared on any of the footage. The man's torment of Sarah was relentless and brutal. It seemed to be everywhere she went, and no place was safe from its presence. At night, when Sarah was trying to sleep, she would see the figure standing at the foot of her bed, its twisted grin fixed in a terrifying expression. During the day, she would see him in the dark corners of her house, watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. He would sit across the room from her at work, disguised as one of her colleagues, with the same twisted grin, taunting her with its eyes. Sarah even found him sitting in the doggy kennels, laughing at her while she tended to her patients. He seemed to revel in her fear. Sarah became a prisoner in her own home, too scared to leave, too scared to sleep. She could feel the man's presence even when she couldn't see it, and it made her constantly on edge and paranoid. Her once peaceful home became a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. The man seemed to be everywhere, lurking in the darkness, waiting for her to drop her guard. The man would often appear in a grotesque and terrifying form, its eyes glowing red, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth twisted into a horrible grin, revealing a mouth full of sharp teeth. Sarah's anxiety and fear started to affect her mental and physical health, causing her to lose weight and have difficulties sleeping. She was always on edge and exhausted. Sarah's fear started to spill over into her professional life as well. She found herself becoming increasingly distracted and disorganized at work. Her colleagues noticed the change in her and started to become concerned, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell them what was really going on. She was too afraid they would think she was losing her mind. The man's presence became an all-consuming obsession for Sarah. She couldn't think of anything else and started to feel like she was being consumed by it. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, just beyond the edge of her sight, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She felt trapped in her own mind and in her own life, and she didn't know how to escape. She was afraid to leave her house, afraid to close her eyes. She started to experience terrifying nightmares featuring the man, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She started to become increasingly isolated as her fear grew, and she felt like she was losing her mind. As the sightings continued, Sarah noticed that other things were changing as well. Objects in her home would be moved, things would go missing, and strange symbols would appear etched on her walls and horrible monstrous noises at all hours of the day. The more the man appeared, the more the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and Sarah found herself questioning her own sanity. One night, as Sarah lay in bed, her mind and body exhausted from the constant fear and anxiety, she heard a noise outside her window. Her heart began to race as she slowly sat up in bed and looked towards the window. Her blood ran cold as she saw the man standing outside, staring at her through the window with that same sinister Cheshire grin stretching across his face. His eyes seemed to gleam in the moonlight, and Sarah could see the malice and malevolence in his gaze. She could feel his presence as if he were physically in the room with her. The smile on his face was eerie and terrifying. It seemed to mock her and her fear. Sarah's mind was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her own terror. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and her heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She realized that her phone and other electronic devices were disabled and she couldn't call for help. She was trapped and alone with the man outside her window. She lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the man, waiting for him to move, to make a sound, to do something, but he just stood there, watching her with that same sinister smile. Eventually, Sarah mustered the strength to get out of bed and run to her front door, locking it tightly and placing a chair against it. She knew it was a futile effort, but it was the only thing she could think to do to protect herself. She lay on her bed, her body shaking and her mind numb with fear, as she heard the man's laughter echoing through the night, taunting her, reminding her that he was still out there, waiting and watching. She knew that she would never be able to escape him and that fear will haunt her forever. Desperate for answers, Sarah turned to various experts in different religions for help. She met with Christian pastors, Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams, and even consulted with spiritual healers and shamans. But none of them were able to provide any answers or explanations for the man who had been haunting her. Feeling defeated and desperate, Sarah decided to seek out the wisdom of a Native American chief. She had heard stories of the indigenous people's belief in skinwalkers and hoped that he might be able to provide some insight into her terrifying experiences. The chief listened to her story with a somber expression, and after she finished, he looked at her with a grave expression. "The creature that has been tormenting you is a skinwalker," he said, "a powerful and malevolent being that can take on the form of any living creature it chooses." The chief went on to explain that skinwalkers are said to be evil witches who have gained the ability to transform into animals through dark and forbidden rituals. They are known to be jealous and vengeful, and will often target those who they perceive as a threat to their power or authority. He told her that a skinwalker's presence can be felt as an unease or a feeling of being watched, but it is difficult to spot them as they can seamlessly blend into human form. Had been watching Sarah for a long time, and had infiltrated every aspect of her life. The skinwalker had taken on her form seamlessly, and manipulated her friends and family. It had control of her electronic devices, hacking into her bank accounts and social media, and trapping her in a web of fear. They are also known to tamper with electronics, disable phone lines, and manipulate the mind of its victims for their own gain. The chief also warned Sarah that skinwalkers feed on fear, and the more scared she was, the more powerful it would become. Sarah was horrified to hear that the man she had been seeing was not just a figment of her imagination, but a real and dangerous creature. The chief's words painted a terrifying and believable picture of a powerful and malevolent force that had been tormenting her. The chief then explained that the only way to defeat a skinwalker is to confront it directly and command it to leave her alone. He made it clear that for this to be effective, Sarah must be completely devoid of fear in her mind and body. Fear is what gives the skinwalker its power over its victim, and without it, the creature is vulnerable. He warned Sarah that the skinwalker would try to intimidate her and use her fear against her, but she must stay strong and not let it affect her. The chief gave her some traditional protection charms, which he said would help her to stay strong and focused, and to see through the skinwalker's illusion. The chief made it clear that facing the skinwalker will not be easy, and that it would require a great deal of courage and determination. But with the right mindset, and the help of the tribe, Sarah could put an end to her nightmare and reclaim her life. As Sarah began to actively fight against the skinwalker, its attacks seemed to ramp up in intensity. Everywhere she went, she would see the man's face, twisted in that same sinister grin, in the faces of strangers passing by on the street, in the expressions of her loved ones, and even in the faces of her own pets. His grotesque face seemed to haunt her everywhere she looked, and she could hardly function without being consumed by fear. Sarah could hear strange and terrifying noises constantly, whether it was the sound of footsteps outside her house or the scratching and whispering at the windows. Sarah's life had become an utter nightmare, as she was unable to shake off the feeling that the skinwalker was always with her, always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She became increasingly isolated, turning away from her friends and family, who could see the change in her, but couldn't understand what was happening. They were becoming increasingly worried, They suggested that she seeks professional help and even wanted to put her in a mental hospital for her own well-being. But Sarah knew it was not a mental illness, it was the skinwalker's influence. It was manipulating her loved ones too, trying to isolate her and make her believe she was crazy. Sarah knew that she had to face the skinwalker head-on, but her fear had become so all-consuming that she didn't think she would be able to do it. Her mind was constantly consumed with thoughts of the skinwalker and the fear of what it might do next. Even when she didn't see it, she could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on her. She felt trapped, unable to escape from the nightmare that her life had become. Sarah knew that she must find a way to confront the skinwalker without fear and put an end to her torment. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself confined to her home, too terrified to venture outside. She was trapped, with no way to escape the constant presence of the man she now knew to be a skinwalker. But despite her fear, Sarah refused to let him break her. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower in fear. One morning, as Sarah lay in bed, her beloved dog Molly came bounding in, leash in mouth, tail wagging excitedly. She nuzzled Sarah's hand, begging to be taken for a walk. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she owed it to Molly to give her a normal life, and that even if she wanted to avoid the skinwalker, the only way to end it was to face her fears. So, with a newfound determination, Sarah put on her coat and stepped out of the house, Molly at her side. As they walked down her usual path. As Sarah and Molly made their way down the familiar path in the woods, Sarah's heart was pounding with fear. The thought of coming face to face with the man in the woods, the skinwalker, filled her with dread. The path was dark and shrouded in shadows, and the air was thick with an eerie sense of doom. Sarah could feel the skinwalker's presence looming closer and closer, and she could hear the sound of his twisted laughter echoing all around her. As they walked, the skinwalker's taunts grew louder and more aggressive. He would shift locations, playing a twisted game of cat and mouse with her. Sarah could hear the sound of his laughter, like the cackling of a madman, coming from all around her. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to herald his approach. The anticipation was almost unbearable, and Sarah's fear was reaching a fever pitch. As they rounded a bend in the path, the skinwalker appeared before her in all his terrifying glory. He was tall and lanky, with multiple arms and razor-sharp teeth. His skin was mottled and scaly, like that of a reptile, and his eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. His grin was wide and sinister, revealing a set of razor-sharp teeth. The smell of rotting flesh filled the air and his claws were like that of a giant bird of prey. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized that she had finally come face to face with her tormentor. But she refused to back down. She glared at the skinwalker and said, "You're nothing but a bully and a coward. You feed on fear and revel in the suffering of others. But I won't give you the satisfaction. I won't be your victim anymore." The skinwalker sneered at her, his form shifting and contorting in a grotesque display of power. "You think you're so brave, human? You think you can defeat me? I am the stuff of nightmares, the embodiment of fear itself. You cannot defeat me." But Sarah was not intimidated. "I don't need to defeat you," she said. "I just need to stand up to you. I won't let you control me anymore. I won't be your puppet." At her words, the skinwalker let out a scream of rage and lunged towards her. But Sarah stood her ground and, as she stared into the monster's eyes, she felt a sudden calm come over her. It was as if she could see through the skinwalker's disguise and into the sad, empty being that lay beneath. And in that moment, she realized that the skinwalker was not a monster at all, but a lost and lonely creature, desperate for the validation he gained from scaring others. The skinwalker's form began to change, shrinking and deflating before her eyes, until he was nothing but a sad, pitiful creature. Sarah could see the true form of the monster, ugly and grotesque, and as she watched, it let out a final cry of despair before disintegrating into nothingness, leaving no trace behind. Sarah stood there for a moment, taking in what had just happened, feeling a mix of triumph and sadness for the defeated creature. She knew that the journey would not end here. The journey of facing her fears will continue, and this was just one step towards it.